Hello, this is Miss Natalie, and I will be reading The Twits by Roald Dahl. It's illustrated by Quentin Blake, and Quentin Blake has a very distinct art style. If you look, it's very scribbly, and he's very famous. He's a very famous artist, and he has illustrated most of Roald Dahl's books. So if you recognize this kind of art, it's probably because you've read a Roald Dahl book before. The Twits. This book is a little old. This is my book from growing up. As you can see, there are a lot of chapters. It's a very short book, actually. And so every couple pages there is a chapter. Hairy faces. What a lot of hairy-faced men there are around nowadays. When a man grows hair all over his face, it is impossible to tell what he really looks like. Perhaps that's why he does it. He'd rather you didn't know. Then there's the problem of washing. When the very hairy ones wash their faces, it must be a big job, as when you and I wash the hair on our heads. So what I want to know is this: how often do all these hairy-faced men wash their hairy faces? Is it only once a week, like us, on Sunday nights? And do they shampoo it? Do they use a hair dryer? Do they rub hair tonic into the top of their face from going bald? To stop their face from going bald? Do they go to the barber to have their hairy faces cut and trimmed, or do they do it themselves in front of the bathroom mirror with nail scissors? I don't know, but next time you see a man with a hairy face, which will probably be as soon as you step out into the street, maybe you will look at him more closely and start wondering about some of these things. Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit was one of these very hairy-faced men. The whole of his face, except for his forehead, his eyes, and his nose, was covered with thick hair. The stuff even sprouted in revolting tufts out of his nostrils and ear holes. Mr. Twit felt that his hairiness made him look terrifically wise and grand, but in truth, he was neither of these things. Mr. Twit was a twit. He was born a twit, and now, at the age of 60, he was a bigger twit than ever. The hair on Mr. Twit's face didn't grow smooth and matted as one does on most hairy-faced men. It grew in spikes that stuck out straight like the bristles of a nail brush. And how often did Mr. Twit wash this bristly nail brush face of his? The answer is never, not even on Sundays. He didn't wash it for years. Dirty beards. As you know, an ordinary, unhairy face like yours or mine simply gets a bit smudgy if it is not washed often enough. And there's nothing so awful about that. But a hairy face is a very different matter. Things cling to the hairs, especially food. Things like gravy go right in among the hairs and stay there. You and I can wipe our smooth faces with a washcloth, and we quickly look more or less all right again. But the hairy man cannot do that. We can also, if we are careful, eat our meals without spreading food all over our faces. But not so the hairy man. Watch carefully next time you see a hairy man eating his lunch, and you will notice that even if he opens his mouth very wide, it is impossible for him to get a spoonful of beef stew or ice cream and chocolate sauce into it without leaving some of it on the hairs. Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth wide when he ate. As a result, and because he never washed, there were always hundreds of bits of old breakfast and lunches and suppers sticking to the hairs around his face. So Roald Dahl is an English writer. He's from England. And there they don't call it dinner, they call it supper. So breakfast, lunches, and suppers. Where were we? They weren't big bits, mind you, because he used to wipe those off with the back of his hand or on his sleeve while he was eating. But if you look closely, not that you'd ever want to, you would see tiny little specks of dried up scrambled eggs stuck to the hairs, and spinach and tomato ketchup, and fish stick and minced chicken livers, and all the other disgusting things Mr. Twit liked to eat. In this picture it says cornflake, tinned sardine. Sardine is a kind of fish. Stilton cheese. Stilton cheese is a very smelly kind of cheese. If you looked closer still, hold your nose, ladies and gentlemen, if you peered deep into the mustachy bristles sticking out over his upper lip, you would probably see much larger objects than objects that had escaped the wipe of his hand, things that had been there for months and months, like a piece of maggoty green cheese or moldy old cornflake, or even a slimy tail of a tinned sardine. Ooh, see, actually you can see this is a tail right here. That's gross. Because of all this, Mr. Twit never went really hungry. By sticking out his tongue and curling it sideways to explore the hairy jungle around his mouth, he was always able to find a tasty morsel here and there to nibble on. What I'm trying to tell you is that Mr. Twit was a foul and smelly old man. He was also an extremely horrid old man, as you will find out in a moment. Miss Twit. Miss Twit was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because that, at any rate, would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Take a look at her. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I doubt it. But the funny thing is that Miss Twit wasn't born ugly. She had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown upon her year after year as she got older. Why would that happen? I'll tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on the face. And when the person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose and a crooked mouth and a double chin and sticky outy teeth, but if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams, and you will always look lovely. Here's a comparison. This is Miss Twit having ugly thoughts, and this is a person with sticky outy teeth and a wonky nose and a double chin. She looks very pleasant. Nothing good shone out of Miss Twit's face. In her right hand she carried a walking stick. She used to tell people that this was because she had warts growing on the sole of her left foot and walking was painful. But the real reason she carried a stick was so that she could hit things with it. Things like dogs and cats and small children. And then there was the glass eye. Miss Twit had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. The glass eye. You can play a lot of tricks with a glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in again anytime you like. You can bet your life Miss Twit knew all the tricks. One morning, she took out her glass eye and dropped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Here's Mr. Twit. Here's his beer in his hand. Mr. Twit sat there drinking his beer slowly. The froth made the white ring on the hairs around his mouth. He wiped the white froth on his sleeve and wiped his sleeve on his trousers. Trousers, again, this is another word. This means pants. But in English, in the Queen's English, the English from England, they call them trousers. "You're plotting something," Miss Twit said, keeping her back turned so he wouldn't see that she was taking out her glass eye. "Whenever you go all quiet like that, I know very well you're plotting something." Miss Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think up of a really nasty trick he could play on his wife that day. "You better be careful," Miss Twit said, "because when I see you starting to plot, I watch you like a wombat." "Oh, do shut up, you old hag," Mr. Twit said. He went on drinking his beer, and his evil mind kept working away on the latest horrid trick he was going to play on the old woman. Suddenly, as Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat, he caught sight of Miss Twit's awful glass eyes staring up at him from the bottom of the mug. It made him jump. "I told you I was watching you," cackled Miss Twit. "I've got eyes everywhere, so you'd better be careful." The frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Miss Twit's bed. He caught a big one down in the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Miss Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Miss Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then, all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Miss Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed." "I'll bet it's the giant skilly-wiggler I saw on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said. "The what?" screamed Miss Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Miss Twit. "Save me! It's all over my feet." "It'll bite off your toes," said Mr. Twit. Miss Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Miss Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water. This one was having a good time. When Miss Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. This was not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. She screamed again. "By golly, it is a giant skilly wiggler," Mr. Twit said. "It'll bite your nose off." Miss Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. Frog's looking like he's having a good time. Wormy spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Miss Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking around it with his fork. "It's a new kind," Miss Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoving them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy." "I find it very tasty," Miss Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavor. Buy the other kind next time." Miss Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why it had a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it was worms!" cried Miss Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. The funny walking stick. To pay Miss Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his workshed. Then he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small the next morning Miss Twit didn't notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly, so the extra bits looked like part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Miss Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now when something is growing very, very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it's happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly you can't even notice it from 1 week to the next. It was the same with Miss Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, So it is, Miss Twit said, looking at the stick. I had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't, for the life of me, think what it was. There's something wrong, all right, Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. What can have happened? Miss Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. It must suddenly have grown longer. Don't be a fool, Mr. Twit said. How can the walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow. Then what on earth has happened? Cried Miss Twit. It's not the stick, it's you, said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now. That's not true, cried Miss Twit. You are shrinking, woman, said Mr. Twit. It's not possible. Oh, yes, it jolly well is, said Mr. Twit. You are shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days. Never, she cried. Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat. You see how much you've shrunk in comparison? You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks. Miss Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. As soon as Miss Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, There you are! You're sitting in your old chair, and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground. Miss Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he had been with the walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, he had done the same with the four legs of Miss Twit's chair. Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair, he cried. You've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air. Miss Twit went white with fear. You've got the shrinks, cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of shrinks I've ever seen. Miss Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. She's dribbling here. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks, he said. What? Gasped Miss Twit. What happens? Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet. And in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes. I can't bear it, cried Miss Twit. It's a terrible disease, said Mr. Twit. The worst in the world. How long have I got? Cried Miss Twit. How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes? Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. At this rate, you're going, he said, shaking his head sadly. I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. But isn't there anything we can do? Cried Miss Twit. There's only one cure for the shrinks, said Mr. Twit. Tell me, she cried. Oh, tell me quickly. We'll have to hurry, said Mr. Twit. I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say, cried Miss Twit. You won't last long if you don't, said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. What must I do? Cried Miss Twit, clutching her cheeks. You've got to be stretched, said Mr. Twit. The next chapter is Miss Twit Gets a Stretching, and I will continue probably tomorrow, so look out for that video.